in these countries trying to find the parents, it's very hard, and COVID makes it that much harder. The last thing on the ground in these countries trying to find the parents, it's very hard, and COVID makes it that much harder. The last thing I'd point out, Joshua, is that these aren't Trump administration lawyers trying to find the children. These are lawyers for groups like ACLU, nonprofit law firms, because the government shrugged that responsibility and said it was too onerous to try to find these parents.
This feels like one of the policies that the Trump administration enacted that seems to frustrate and infuriate people across the political spectrum. I've heard so many people say they can't find these parents because they didn't give a damn. They don't care about these children. They don't care about these parents. They didn't bother to make a system to track them because they didn't care what happened to them. That's why this has occurred. Is there any evidence to back that up? Or is there another explanation? Is this possibly something that was intended to be done and then there was a logistical problem, or the system just fell apart?
Well, let me take you back to 2018 and May 3rd, when there was a Situation Room meeting with all of the president's top advisors, and they said, we need to start prosecuting parents because we are seeing too many parents come across the border with their children, and we think that we are incentivizing them to stay here because we don't prosecute people who come with children like we do single adults. But then they said in order to do that, we would have to separate them because you can't send a child into the custody of the U.S. Marshals. As a result, they went ahead and moved forward anyway, knowing it would lead to separations and knowing that they did not have a system to track the parents and the children as they moved through the system. They even looked back to 2017 to a pilot program they had done, and they said, what were the lessons learned there? Well, the lessons learned there was that they didn't want to separate any child younger than 12 because they determined that those children were too young to find their way back to their parents on their own because they didn't have a system then and they didn't create a system in 2018 that would keep them together. So the intention was to try to drive down the numbers of families that they were seeing come across the border to try to claim asylum. But what they didn't put in place and what they knew would happen as a consequence was they didn't put in place a system to keep these families together, reunite them, and they knew the consequence would be separation. And guess what? They did a show of hands vote and they moved forward anyways.
Before I let you go, Julia, I wonder what the conditions are like now and what they may be like going forward. The Atlantic did a piece where they visited a detention center and saw some really horrific conditions. A number of the kids had not had a chance to bathe since they crossed the border. They were wearing the same clothing they crossed the border in. Some of them were covered in bodily fluids, including breast milk for the teenage moms who were breastfeeding. Has there been any move to try to improve the conditions these kids are in or to just help these children out in any humanitarian way?
Well, I will say the 545, we understand that none of those are in the custody of the U.S. government anymore. They were moved out of Health and Human Services. Sometimes they go to live with a family member. Sometimes they are brought in by a sponsor. In this case, though, we're talking about children who have recently come across the border, whether they be with their families or whether they be on their own, what we call unaccompanied minors. They are often staying in Customs and Border Protection longer than they should be. When they move to Health and Human Services, they are by and large in clean places, even though it's no substitute for being in the care of your parent.
Right.
They do have schooling, they do have meals. I've toured those places. It's when they stay in those Customs and Border Protection facilities for too long that it becomes a problem. And it becomes a problem when it gets overcrowded and these systems just don't work to take care of children. They weren't built for children. And so until we see a change in those policies, unfortunately, some of those conditions can happen.
NBC's Julia Ainsley. Julia, thanks for the latest on this.
Thank you.
Coming up, owners of some local pizzerias are getting some relief during the pandemic thanks to a new app.